I was so focused on the future that I forgot about the present moment, right?
Mhm.
And our present is a direct result of our past. So if we focus on the present moment, we build our future by default. So just being in that middle tier instead of trying to be in one, like focus too much, like, oh, I was hurt, I was this, I can't get over it. That's the past. I need to be safe. I need to build this. I need to have this. That's the future. But if we're here now and we live our lives to the best of our ability, try not to hurt anyone, try to enrich, create, like I said, right? Enrich somebody else's life. Make sure they're better off because they met you. Your future is being built in that moment. It guarantees a future.
Welcome to A Way of Thinking podcast. This podcast is dedicated to lighting the way towards greater inner peace and purpose. Hello and welcome to this episode of A Way of Thinking. I'm your host, Jessica Huang, and in this episode, I have the pleasure of talking with Renzo del Castillo. Renzo is a poet and author of Still, a collection of poetry. And in this episode, I have the pleasure of talking with him about his experience as an immigrant and asylum seeker and how that informed many of his decisions, including ultimately becoming a healthcare executive. Renzo also shares about how he reconnected to poetry and how he sees purpose as something that is ever evolving. He also shares about vulnerability and how he sees it as his strength, but that there's also many layers to vulnerability. Renzo's also kind enough to share two of his poems from his collection of poetry. So keep listening to hear my conversation with Renzo. And before we get started, I'll make two quick announcements. So, first off, if you are enjoying tuning in to A Way of Thinking podcast, then I invite you to donate to the podcast and support the efforts that go behind the scenes to make this podcast a reality. You can do so at my website, jessicahuangcoaching.com/donate. And second, if you are someone who wants to leave behind the corporate job they've been in and reconnect to the creative person within and move in the direction of what you really want for yourself, then I invite you to book a free strategy session with me. You can do so at my website, jessicahuangcoaching.com. And now, without further ado, here is my conversation with Renzo del Castillo. Our guest today is Renzo del Castillo. Renzo is a poet and author of Still, a collection of poetry which focuses on the immigrant experience, a family's journey from Lima, Peru to Miami, Florida, as political refugees and asylum seekers, and the impact that had on the life of a boy as he grew into a man. He also works as a healthcare executive for the past 15 years, and he is based in Miami, Florida. So, welcome to the show, Renzo.
Hi, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on the show. So, I've spent all morning reading your collection of poems, and it's been lovely just kind of immersing myself into your world, which I was sharing with you before we hit the record button. And it's been really what I was sharing with you before we started was how I'm not actually someone that reads a lot of poetry, and yet I was so enjoying reading your collection of poems, and they were really making me wanna read more poetry, honestly. So thank you so much for kind of bringing me into the world of poetry first off. And it's been so lovely kind of, I don't know, like, getting to know you through your work in a way, and I'm so excited to have you on the show, so welcome, and let's get started.
Okay, I'm in it. Let's go.
Alright, so, I first want to ask you what I start all my, interviews off with, which is how do you define purpose to you?
That's a great question. I was actually talking about it with a friend yesterday. When I was very young. I emigrated to the United States with my family, and we didn't have much money. So I was very focused on getting money because money equaled safety. And I went fully corporate for a while after college, and I was unhappy, and I had reached financial stability. Uh, my family didn't have to worry about anything anymore, really. I was very lucky. But I have a good friend. His name is Kurt. He wrote the English forward in the book. And Kurt is, he was in his 50s. He's close to his 60s now. So he's a bit older. And he asked me, "What is your purpose?" Or no, what are you passionate about? And I
Mm.
couldn't answer him because everything I was passionate about was in relation to someone else. To the point where I was frustrated. And I asked him, "What does this have to do with anything?" And he said, and this is how he talks. So he goes like, "Well, follow your passions because they'll lead you to your purpose. And a
Mm.
life filled with purpose is one of joy." That is legitimately how he talks. So, Kurt, if you're listening, I hope I'm doing right by you. And it took me a while to figure that out. But I realized that I was passionate about helping others. I don't know if it was like a narcissistic thing or I just want you to be better off because we met. But I think it's an altruistic thing too, right? I think why not want to leave the world better off than you left it? And then I also love like puzzles and brain teasers and logic games. So in healthcare, which I have a difficult time with when I was younger because I considered it a failed system,
Mm.
I've realized that I could help my resources grow. Like the people that report to me, I work for them. They don't work for me. I don't have a job if I don't clear the path for them to do what they do. I no longer do. I enable others to do, which is a very different thing. And I feel called to do that, to help bridge those gaps for them. And I solve complex issues every day. That's why I have a job. So for me, all of that to say, purpose is a journey, right? There's really, you might feel better thinking, okay, that at least I would. I used to be very black and white where it came to purpose. I'm like, okay, this is my purpose, and I don't have to worry about it anymore, and I can just go live my life. When we are ever evolving, we're always changing. So I think it's important to see purpose as fluid and as a journey instead of a destination, if that
Absolutely.
makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, I love that so much. I firmly agree with that where it's like it's this ever evolving thing, and I so appreciate your friend kind of asking you this question and kind of moving you in a different direction, which I think is so beautiful because it led to this book clearly. So, but I love that ability to go, "Oh, here's where I," and the fact that you're able to bring in your purpose into your work as well, the way that you describe being a manager and being able to enable the people that work with you and you're not really managing them, like that the way that you described that was so beautiful because it
Mm,
is true. It's like you're finding purpose through all these different ways, so it's not just necessarily this art form, but you're bringing it into your workplace as well, which I think is really beautiful. So thank you for sharing that.
thanks.
I am actually curious. So along those lines, you've been working as a healthcare executive for the past 15 years.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because I totally understand that. I would say that I feel very similarly of this idea where as immigrants or for me as a child of immigrants, it was important to make money and it was important to kind of establish yourself in this new country and create that stability. And so do you feel like your poetry was that something you always wanted to do or was that something that that was kind of sitting by the wayside or what was kind of your relationship to that through this time period?
Ooh. So, like I said, we immigrated when I was very young. And when we came over, we went from like upper middle class or lower upper class to having nothing to the point, and this is a story that really has marked me. I remember my parents telling us at dinner, like, go ahead, we ate already.
Mm.
But I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't old enough to understand everything behind it. I just felt this very big discrepancy, which I mentioned, right? I like to say that I went full Scarlett O'Hara, as God is my witness. My family will never go hungry again. I will never go hungry again.
Mm.
To be afraid to have the lights turned off, or that our immigration process wasn't going well, right? Really impacted me. And it meant we didn't have a lot of means. And one of the things that I'm a huge proponent of is travel, because travel breeds empathy, it breeds exposure to other cultures, a variety of different things. I wasn't able to do that. But what my family gifted me was a love of education. It's not just like you have to, I love education. I love being learned, right? Like to dive into topics and know more about things. And I learned how to read pretty early on. So when I was about 3, apparently I had learned to read on my own with some blocks, and my parents took me to that, and then they started giving me books. So I was reading like The Count of Monte Cristo like at age 7 or 8, as an example. And my grandmother was a university professor, my dad's mom, and she would give me like poetry books, and that's kind of where I started falling in love with like Neruda, Pablo Neruda, who's pretty
Mhm.
big in South America, the Chilean poet, and others. I discovered Bukowski, Wisława Szymborska on my own, again at a very young age. So poetry was always a big part of my life. But it was my cousin Pablo who passed away recently, a couple of years ago. He was like in this rap group in high school, and he was like, "Dude, write poetry." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "You can do this. Like, you're always reading this. Go ahead and write it." So I started writing poetry at a relatively young age, and um, just it just blossomed from there. It was something that I went to school for aerospace engineering, and 6 credits short of graduation, I changed to poetry, to the delight
Oh.
and full support of my immigrant. No, not at all. Of my immigrant parents, they were afraid, right? I think a lot of the friction that we have with our parents comes from them wanting to keep us safe, from a place of fear of the unknown, right? And us rebelling against that, and maybe perpetuating the cycle later with our children or nephews, or
Mm.
nieces. Um, and I fully focused on poetry in college. I'm classically trained. I did that. I loved it. So I don't know where the question was going. I got lost in the story.
Oh, no worries. Well, so then I'm so curious then. So you're saying that you actually studied poetry. So how did you end up as a healthcare executive then?
Okay, that's a story. Well, I'm 40 years old. So I got into Cambridge for grad school and for poetry. But around that time, if your audience remembers, the people who blew up the towers came in with a student visa. I had
Mm.
political asylum, and I came in with a student visa, and I had friends who were deported because it was up to the immigration officials' discretion who was at the gate at the time. My friends were not terrorists, but they were deported. So my family talked to me and said, "Hey, maybe you should finish here." And
Mm.
I said, "I understand." I I did. I wasn't upset about that. I was just upset that I couldn't do it. And I mean, I tried
Mm.
getting like a special passport. They lost it. They lost the application, and back then $800 might have as well have been 80,000, and I didn't have the money to do it again. So I ended up doing communications, mass communications. I went to UF, University of Florida, because I saw it as a mixture of the technical aspects of engineering that I enjoyed with the communication aspect of poetry that I also enjoyed. And when I graduated, it was 2009, right around the time of the bubble. So nobody who graduated with me was doing what they went to school for.
Mm.
So I freelanced for a while, and that was good money, but not steady money. And I had to move back down to Miami to see about helping my mom, helping the family. Um, so I took a job at a call center, and it was a healthcare company. And within a week, I was doing projects for them, and it just evolved from there.
Got it. Okay. So that's leading you into healthcare. And then, so on the flip side, you mentioned this friend coming to you and asking you about what are you passionate about. And so, is that where poetry came back into your world, or had you been writing poetry throughout these last 15 years?
I stopped. I was heartbroken when I
Mm.
couldn't go to Cambridge.
Mm.
Like you have this image of what you're like. I wanted to be a long-haired hippie poet in Cambridge writing stuff. And No, I was heartbroken, so I stopped. But my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2017, and they gave him 3 months to live. And he actually lived for 3 years. And two
Mhm.
and a half of those years without morphine, doing kettlebells, like he was doing great. And we all moved back into the house. My sister has 3 kids with my brother-in-law. They have 2 dogs. I had my dog at the time, Pearl, and with my mom and dad to try to help out. And after my dad passed away, I started writing again. It was a mixture of things. I have a friend named Mike who is in the arts. He is in the army too, but he's involved with, you know, um, I'm blanking on the term, but just fundraising and fundraising for ballet companies and all that stuff. And he told me, "Hey, I've been waiting for you to start writing again for years. I have this whole strategy. You have to submit to these journals. Here are the mid-tier journals. Here are the large journals, the big journals. And if you get 3 published here, then you can go for the book. Or if you get 6 published here, then you can do this, etc." So I had that support. And then I also met somebody who's a good friend of mine now, who's a Russian Miami-based photographer called Anastasia Samoylova. And I met her at an exhibition on her work called Flood Zone, which is about climate change and living in the threshold space of climate change, like a, a port city like Miami, which I do. And we hit it off. We started talking, and the she asked me if I did anything. I told her I used to be a poet, and she's like, "Why don't you still write?" I'm like, "About what?" "I don't know." And she said, "Well, write. You like my work? Write about my work." So that's ekphrastic poetry, right? Poetry that's
Mhm.
about other art forms. And I just started from there, and I started finding poets in Miami, doing open mics, started being part of that scene as it was developing into what it is now, which is pretty large. So that's how I ended up doing poetry again.
Amazing. I'm curious what your coworkers think about you publishing a work of poetry like this. Do they know?
They know. They Not all of them know, but some of them know, and they're super supportive. They're surprised. Some are not surprised, just because the thing is, I use art. I think art, as I mentioned before, like travel, is a way to develop empathy. Art is an analytical relation, helps you develop an analytical relationship between yourself and an object, right? So you start looking at things from different perspectives. You start developing analytical skills. So I use a lot of that at work in order to develop teams or address complex issues. So those colleagues who work with me in that sense are not surprised, and they've all bought a book and they're very supportive. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. I love that. Actually, this is reminding me. So prior to this, I was telling you about some of my favorite poems that you had in your collection. And one of them that I had asked you to share is the one called Brothers.
Okay.
Because it kind of and I love it because actually I feel like it goes so much to what we were just talking about, this idea where you're almost like I you're paving a way for someone else right now. I see that a
Mm.
little bit, right? Where it's like you're showing people right now that ability to go, "I've worked in my corporate job for the last 15 years, but I can still create this beautiful work of art," right? Like, I can still have bring that back into my world and be able to share this part of myself that is different from what you might see in this kind of corporate life that I have. And
Yeah.
I found that so beautiful when I was kind of reading up on you and when it was shared with me to have you on the podcast, I was like, yes, absolutely. Because I love that so much. And I felt like that poem spoke to that idea of kind of like talking to someone else who is younger than you and kind of giving them that feeling of like, well, go after it too, like inspiring them a little bit. So, well, first I would love like what were you were telling me a little bit about the background of it, but I would love for you to share a little bit about that and then if you could share the poem.
Sure. I have a good friend now named Andy Diaz. He goes by adding passion on Instagram, and he's a local Miami poet. And we met at an open mic, and we hit it off because I really just love him very much. He's like a little brother to me. I see. I'm 40. He's 26, so he's like about 14 years younger. So I see a lot of I don't want to say I see a lot of myself in him, but I see that he's encountering a lot of the same things that I did, asking a lot of the same questions in terms of what's purpose, like this existential dread that we move forward with. So we decided to do a collaborative piece that we performed, and the poem Brothers that you see published in the book is actually like the my side of it, right? But the way that it's intended to perform, it's like every paragraph has his paragraph in response that feeds into the other one, and when you perform it, somewhere out there, if he ever publishes a book, you will see the other half of that like friendship medallion, right? Um, but it's interesting that you say that because I do see this poem as, either advice to a younger person or talking to yourself. Like the poet, like separating myself from it, like the author of this talking to themselves. It could be read that way. I don't want to define how somebody reads it. I think once you put art out there, it's no longer yours, and it's up to the person's interpretation. But it was a response. I'll share with you that it was a response to languishing, right? You might have heard Adam Grant use the term, or other workplace psychologists like this. You're not depressed, but you're not happy, and you're just there, and you're not living life. You're not participating. You're not active. You're just observing your life. And this poem is a bit of a response to that, because I think that the antithesis to languishing is creation. Like if you create, you can't be passive,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's so beautiful. I would love to see the whole, like, exchange one day.
Sure.
Maybe you guys will can do a recording and we'll share it.
We've performed it a few times. It's the audience likes it, yeah, because we have very different styles. He's more like a I can't do it from memory. He does all his stuff he writes it down, but he does it from memory, and he's much more of a like a slam poetry style than I am. But he's also evolving. I don't want to put him in a box.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you mind, like, reading the poem?
Not at all. Brothers, little brother, disregard your constraints. You find beauty in life when you ignore the ticking clock. Time is ongoing, incomplete, eternal. Experience the passage of time. Honor it. We evolve between moments because we choose to. Use your time. Give it value. Live in the moment. Choose a path from the infinite choices before you and close yourself off from the distraction of other paths. There is no other road but the one that you're on. Don't be ruled by the tyranny of what if. Affirm the moment, and in doing so, affirm all of existence. Be lured by your senses. Build relationships. They're hard work, but it's work worth doing. There's an inherent romanticism in the amount of effort put forth to keep things going. When the old genre of romanticism can no longer sustain you, look for a new genre. You know you're in the right place at the right time when you meet the right person. Indulge in the sapiosexual experience of the enjoyment and sensuality of dialogue. Walk and talk with others as a response to death. Create. Art changes as you change. Feel abandoned by its love in the moments between actions. People leave us, transforming excitement into longing and a desire to follow in the alchemy of meaning. The only meaning that matters is the meaning you create, not only in your identity, but also in your identity in relation to others. Make the choices that determine who you are, without fear. All you have is now, little brother. All you will ever have is now.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
You're welcome. Thanks for wanting to hear it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was one that as I was reading through, because you had shared with me a list of poems I requested, and so I was reading those, but then I kind of would end up skimming all the others, and then I would be like, "Oh, I love this one." And so this one and another one, which we're gonna talk about later, it were 2 of them that really stuck out to me, I think, especially in line with talking about purpose and all this, and so I love this, that ability to kind of just speak to the idea of, like, infinite choices, of openness and finding that path and negating all the others. Like, I thought that was so beautiful in helping in guiding someone else. So, thank you
Yeah,
for sharing that.
you're welcome.
Okay. let's go there next, actually, because yeah. So Renzo was obviously listening to the podcast a little bit and noticed that there's a lot of us talking about yoga, and so I did notice that you were talking about yoga. Well, you were talking about there's a poem. It's called Siddhartha something, right? I don't have the name in
I
front of
think
me.
it's Siddhartha's son.
Yes. So I noticed that one when I was reading, and then you had mentioned that you had yoga stories. So now I'm kind of curious, like what has, and oh, that was the thing I was thinking of before actually, is you were talking about how actually your poetry was this kind of unraveling or this ability to kind of like guide you through what your experiences are. But go ahead. I'm gonna stop talking and
Sure.
let you tell.
So I remember being younger, I didn't really one of the things that defined me based on what I shared, like always worried about safety, I never was in the present moment. I was always thinking about tomorrow. So I always trying to mitigate what would happen tomorrow, and my life was happening while I wasn't there, right? And which meant that at that point I had no patience for yoga or desire to explore it, right? I was also obese as a kid. I weighed like 240 pounds when I was 12. And then eventually I started working out, but yoga's fantastic for recovery, aside from, and we'll get into the spirituality of it and the philosophy of it. So I remember I was a couple of, some time ago, my friends and I had permits to hike the Grand Canyon. And, it takes you like a year to get them, and we're all going. So I was making a left turn and driving to go to my house, and some guy ran the red light like at 70 miles an hour, something like that, and crashed into me. And then he he T-boned me, and then he hit the other cars that were in the intersection.
Oh my God.
And the car was a total loss. Everybody was fine, thank goodness, but it really messed up my knees. And since I had permits, I taped them up and went and hiked the Grand Canyon anyway.
Oh my
So when I
God.
got back from that, yeah, I was young. When I got back from that, my knees were shot. Like I was in pain. Nothing I did helped until I eventually took up yoga. And after about 3 to 4 months, I was able to run marathons again,
Wow.
which is crazy just how much it can help you heal in terms of flexibility. Because not only does it help the tendons and the muscles heal, like it strengthens all the other muscles around it to take some of the work on it, right? So I developed a very healthy respect for yoga. But more than that, while practicing yoga, it was such a metaphor for what I needed to do in my life at that time, which was be uncomfortable in the present moment.
Mhm.
Like you're not going to be perfect, and you're going to be really uncomfortable for an extended period of time as you're holding certain poses. But man, it's fulfilling, and the benefits come from that, right? Like you have if you're not you're going to tip over, you're going to fall, you're not going to keep your form. So that is one of the beginning of the yoga story. And then about 3 weeks before my father passed away, just to give you an idea, my dad was like a mix of, he was an army major, so he was very strict and stern, but he was also very goofy and loving. So imagine like Ned Flanders, but Catholic, mixed with Ted Lasso, right? And then some army guy that was very, very rigid. Um, 3 weeks before he passed, I was outside working out, doing yoga, and he was sitting down on, in the backyard, just like to take some sun, enjoy the fresh air. And he calls me over and he says, "Son, I'm worried about your immortal soul." I'm translating from Spanish, but basically that he's like, "You're
Mm.
doing this thing that's not Catholic," and I'm like, "Look, Dad. Normally, when I hear viewpoints like that, I lose my patience, but that day I had it, you know." That day I had it. So we start talking about yoga, and I tell him like, no, it really helps me be present. Like it's made me a better. I think it's made me a better person,
Mm.
and I really enjoyed it. And he said, okay. And then that conversation evolved, and I need to take a step back and give you some context. When I was young, I was considered highly intelligent when I was a kid, and when I would come home with a test, like let's say I'm 9 years old and I had 95, my dad would be at his desk, look at look at the test and say, were you sick? No. Were you emotionally distraught? No. What could you have done differently to get the 5 points you needed on this test? Okay. I come back home with 100. Were you sick? Were you emotionally distraught?
Mm.
I see you chose not to answer these 2 extra credit questions. Why didn't you? And I'm like, because I knew I had 100. So it wouldn't be, why would I need to answer these 2 questions? And he said, son, God punishes pride. And what was it that he said? God punishes pride. And if you want to study, if you want 100, you need to study for 200. So I grew up thinking that, um, my worth was determined by what I could provide, like
Mm.
that I was worthy of love unless I could, it was transactional, right? You need to understand that to understand this part. So the yoga conversation just led to us talking there for about half an hour. And uh, I don't know if you've ever heard something that you didn't know you needed to hear until you heard it.
Mhm.
But my dad said, I know I made you feel like you weren't enough while you were growing up. I'm sorry. Before, whenever I brought it up, he's like, oh, but look how good you turned out. Do the second slap a little harder and
Mhm.
then laugh and left. But he said, no, I know I made you feel like you weren't good enough growing up, and I'm sorry. You were a smart kid, and I was too tied up in your intelligence with my identity, and I didn't have the language to express that. But I'm your father, and I love you. And I know that if you half-ass anything, you wouldn't be happy. He's right. He was right. I still need therapy. I still, still have all those therapy bills. I still deal with all of that stuff. But if my dad had passed away without that conversation, I think that whenever I went by his grave, I would have that resentment still build up inside. Even though we had a really good relationship, honestly, like it was good. But because of that, um, I don't have that. I'm free. And I think yoga played a little part in that. So that's the yoga story.
Mm. That is such a beautiful story. I mean, I think it's so I mean, first off, it is amazing just how it was able to kind of come into your life when you needed it and heal you
Mm,
and all of these great external things, but it's interesting because as you were telling it, I was like, I can see the pieces of your story in your collection. It kind of it runs as now whenever I as you're talking, it's like there's all these little threads that are kind of sprinkling throughout, there I remember you writing at the end of some of the poems, like saying that you are enough, you are beloved, like these kind of ideas. And so now as you're saying that, I see that reflected in the words that you have written in your poems.
mm,
And I think it's so beautiful. But what an incredible story to have that connection point with your father right before his passing.
mm,
And it's interesting because yes, I think many people have this kind of relationship with their parents where their parents have pushed them and made them feel like they weren't enough and they had to just keep going and had that similar. But for you to kind of get this beautiful arc and be able to share that conversation with him is something so beautiful.
It was the first time I saw him as a 5-year-old boy who wouldn't get attention at his house unless he excelled. My
Mhm.
grandfather was a surgeon. My grandmother was an opera singer, activist. Started a nonprofit for single moms. She was a university professor. So they were very, very tough on my dad and his 2 brothers, my uncles. So it's interesting because it makes me think of this whole generational thing, right? Especially from the immigrant perspective.
Yeah.
I think I think the American dream is a bit of a fallacy, and I think education is not the answer to get out of poverty or a social situation because I'm not going to get into the whole like university system right now or the the institutional structures that are in place that don't necessarily get there, but after World War II, I think Great Britain, in order to get money after the death of the monarchy, leased or sold a lot of their telegraph lines, a lot of their communication conduits to the United States, which went to South America. And whenever there was a need for immigration, America's the land of plenty. Come in here, you'll get it. And then when like the economy went down, like, oh, no more immigrants. Oh, we need cheap labor. Let's pull in immigrants, right? So we come to this country thinking if we just study hard enough, if we just do this, if we get the grades, then we'll do it. And I can tell you from my personal experience, that's not the case because I graduated the year of the financial bubble, right? So um, the I think my dad, as an immigrant, was informed by that viewpoint, and that's what he pushed on us. Because my friends have very similar experiences with their parents who are immigrants. You have to study so that you can have money, and you have to do it for the family. We sacrificed everything to be here, so you have to make something out of that sacrifice. So that's that generational weight that's put on you. So I definitely that experience humanized my dad for me. Like I knew he was a person, but I never saw him that vulnerable. Not
Right.
even when my parents ended up together, but they got divorced. So, like even in the divorce where I think I saw him at his most vulnerable, it was that moment where I just saw him as a child. And I wanted to pick him up and hug him and take care of him. It
Mhm.
was it was almost like hugging myself in a way.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And
I mean, I I think it's so true that what you were sharing there about seeing how it is that kind of passed down kind of generational thing that's going on there where it's like, well, your grandfather was hard on your father and then your father passed that down to you and so it's seeing how that's what informed him to be and along with the immigrant experience and all of this, like there's so much there that informed his experience, which then informed how he treated you and in making you not feel like you were enough and pushing you hard and all that. But it's interesting because it also creates you into who you are, right? It made it so that you did excel and you were able to kind of create this life that helped, your family and all these great things. And so it serves a purpose in a way, but it's like that's why I think it's kind of it's amazing or there's like this beauty of how you were able to take that, build this life, fulfill that kind of, the financial security and all that, and now come full circle and be able to say, "Well, let me express it through the art form that was always within me."
yeah, and I just want to make it, clear that it was a complex thing, right? And I know you're
Okay.
not saying this, but just in case my mom is listening and she's gonna be mad, no, my dad was super loving. He was very supportive. But there was also this side of the coin. So it was almost like a mixed message for years,
Sure.
So, but yeah, it definitely made me. He's inspired a number of those poems. If you read the book,
Mhm. Yes, and absolutely. I think you make a great point because even when like what I think about a lot of times is like even when our parents are really hard on us in that way or trying to push us, like there is a certain undercurrent of love there, right? Of care as well. And I don't want to lose sight of that. And so thank you for pointing that out because
No
it's
worries.
never that we want to look at our, like I don't want to paint a one-dimensional picture of your
Of course.
father by any means.
And I'm not saying you are. If my mom listens, I know that I'm gonna hear it, so I'm just gonna be very clear.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, but I think it is a really good, point to make, right? Is that our parents are trying to care for us and want the best for us at the end of the day, and so it may come through these tough experiences and these things that we need to then later process and whatnot, as you mentioned, but there is also this, like, care and wanting the best for you that is there. I mean, I think in essence, you were mentioning the American dream. I think in essence, the American dream is coming to this country for a better life for your children, right? And so, like, I see our parents as pushing us because they want better for us than they had. Like, that is the whole reason why they went through this sacrifice and
Yeah,
everything that they go through to come here.
agreed.
Yeah.
Def
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability
yeah,
because that was something that was really ringing through my mind as I was reading your book is just how beautifully vulnerable it is and I was curious like what your kind of impression of vulnerability is, or how it felt putting out such vulnerable work into the world.
It's again, I had a recent conversation about this. I have a good friend. He's a former Marine. We met in college and we hit it off. He's like 6'4". He's blonde. We call him Drago because he looks like Ivan Drago from Rocky, but he's American, so we just call him Drago. And he's doing a lot of work right now in vulnerability. And we talked maybe a couple weeks ago or a week ago, and he brought up the fact that one thing he admired about me was that I always seemed okay with vulnerability. And I told him, yes and no. There are some things that I'm very private about, some things that, if you read between the lines in some of those poems about relationships, that I had to overcome and grow. But I've never seen vulnerability as a weakness because I have a very strong sense of community, right? I love building community. I am a product of, the book is called Still. I'll give you, I'll, I'll, I'll give you some context. One of the reasons that the book is called Still is that there was about 6 or 7 years, in the last 6 or 7 years, um, a lot of the people that I cared about started dying. I
Mm.
lost them. My
So
father,
sorry.
my grandmother, his mom, my best friend's mom, my dog, my cousin who I mentioned, my little cousin, a couple of friends. The relationship that I thought I was going to end up marrying that person just went away. So I thought life had stopped giving me things and just started ripping them away,
Mm.
right? And logically, it's not true. Like, we just, maybe you and I become super good friends after this, right? We don't know. Like, life still gives you things every day.
Mhm.
But emotionally, that's where I was. Emotionally, I felt that way. And I had an epiphany one day eating sushi because somebody that I love very much introduced me to that. So, for example, the first time you tried, I don't know, like, I don't know, like maybe the first time you tried ceviche, I'm Peruvian, like ceviche. Did you try it because you thought, oh, that looks good, or because somebody you cared about said, hey, try this, this is cool? Or your favorite movie, maybe somebody showed that to you, right? So that means, to me, it means that we are the product. We are made up of all the little pieces of everybody we've ever loved.
Absolutely. That's so
So,
beautiful.
and if that's true,
Mm.
then in the way that I comb my hair or tie a tie or laugh or step out of a car, my dad is with me. My grandmother's with me. My dog is with me, right? And in that sense, they're still here, which is one of the reasons the book is called Still. The other reason is that I needed to stop being focused on the future and be still in the present moment to realize all these things. So that vulnerability, to be able to ask for help from others, has never been an issue for me. Public speaking has never been an issue for me. Looking dumb hasn't ever been an issue for me. But to So vulnerability has been my strength in that way. But I've recently discovered that there are layers to vulnerability, and just because you can do those things does not mean you're being vulnerable. It does not mean you are being present with your partner, with your friends, with your coworkers, with the people in your life. You can be very kind, and maybe you know each other for years, and after that, they might not even know who you are because you weren't truly vulnerable, right?
Mm.
So it's vulnerability to me is our greatest strength, and I'm trying to enhance it by building community.
I love that. You're so right about the layers because it's like there's certain things that I see it as kinda like we have certain areas where we're naturally comfortable being
Hmm.
vulnerable about, and then there's other aspects where it's like, oh, we're still kind of tucked away in these
Yeah, I know.
areas, right? Where we're, like, not quite comfortable sharing them fully in the same way as others. So I can definitely see how it's like certain parts you're like, "Oh, this is free flowing, I'm vulnerable, we're good here." And then it's like and then you come across these other aspects where you're like, "Oh, no, that was a wall, not quite vulnerable there yet." Is that what you're speaking of? Or,
Yeah,
how
yeah.
would you
So
talk about that?
I'll be vulnerable with you now. So, and after I had after that relationship that I thought was going to be marriage ended, I went into this whole like John Cusack high fidelity. Let me go ask my exes because for the most part, I'm friends with a lot of them.
Mm.
There was nobody cheated on anybody, nobody did anything. It was just it didn't work out. And the majority of them, the consensus was, you were a good boyfriend, you were very kind, you were very nice, but there's a part of you that I never knew. There's a part of you that you never shared. Yo, that's not being a good boyfriend, you know? Like I realized that I had some work to do in terms of being able to be vulnerable with the person that I'm supposed to be vulnerable with, you know? So
Mm.
I'm very lucky that I have good relationships with these women that have been kind enough to give me their honest opinion and not say, we don't need to talk about this. What are you asking about, right? Um, and I'm also very grateful that I have the opportunity to change my stars in a way, right? Like I don't have to be who I was. I can change that.
I love that. That's amazing because I think it's rare to be able to get that kind of reflection from your past partners, and
Hmm.
what a beautiful, like, opportunity I see it as, of saying, "Oh, that's something that I can now work on," because otherwise we become blind to the reasons why, like, these aspects, right? And now you're like, "Oh, let me go and explore how can I be more vulnerable?"
It's so easy to tear something down, right? Like it would be very easy for me, like, they were crazy. Nah, like there's nothing more infuriating, I think, than being referred to as crazy because it's so diminishing, right? But it's things that I've heard
Mhm.
people say and I've said in the past, right? Which is totally invalidates somebody's perspective, somebody's experience, which is not what you'd like to do. And to be able to take that and grow from it and just have the ability, and this is where vulnerability comes in with yourself, right?
Mhm.
Look at yourself and say, yo, you weren't at your best here, right? Like let's if we're honest with each other, you and I, me and you, us, like you could have handled this better. And I think it's very important to do that. I think that's why it's so important to have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. Um, and things like yoga, exercise help with that, right? Because you'll never be the most flexible. You'll never be the strongest. Your bench won't be the highest. You won't be the fastest, but you'll be more flexible, stronger, faster than you were yesterday. And I think that's what matters, right? So there is, and also in the book, you'll see like there's this drive for self improvement or self knowledge. And, and I think it's important.
Yeah, what's coming up for me as you were saying that is I so appreciate in your work this it feels like you're almost reflecting on these different parts of your life, right? Like they're all it it's how you're processing now what you've been through in the past. You can see that through different life experiences, through your family's immigrant experience, and also through different relationships. And so can you talk a little bit about what has been like for you, kind of going through this process of kind of turning your life into your art?
Well, it's the book is autobiographical and it's not, right? Like
Mhm.
there's, for example, I think there's a poem called Deborah, and in it, I am not as dry as the protagonist, and I wanted to explore what it would be like to be so detached because I'm the opposite. So it's an exercise in that imagination. Or there's a poem called Photograph that's a reimagining of how my parents or parents of somebody like me would have met and how their marriage began that would have ending in divorce, right? But it's not exactly what happened to my parents. So it's interesting because you I guess I'm taking key moments as settings that happen in my life, right? Because I think we can imagine our experiences inform our imagination. It's hard to imagine something you haven't known about or experienced, right? Which is why I think it's so important to travel and explore and connect with other people to build that library, build that imagination. That it's such an important tool and blessing, right? But it is a reflection on themes that are important to me, themes that I think are universal. because one of the reasons that I wrote the book is, God, I've been in situations where they're like, immigrants are this, but you're not like that. No, no, you're one of the good ones, right? I'm like, oh, okay.
Thanks.
And the person coming from that expressed that viewpoint is not a bad it's so easy to do a good, bad, black, white. They're not a person that I've known to have ill intent, but that is their experience with immigrants, right?
Mhm.
Or, like, oh, you're Peruvian? My gardener's Peruvian. I'm like, great. My plumber is American. What's your point? There's nothing wrong with being a plumber. There's nothing wrong with being a gardener. But it felt like I did have at that time a chip on my shoulder about it because as an immigrant and the way that I grew up, as you saw, I felt like I always had to prove myself. Like, why am I in different footing than you? What do you like that? Those were very frustrating things. And I think it's important that if somebody isn't an immigrant, which I think we all are in a way, um, and can read this book and find something that they can identify with, then they can see that our experiences aren't that different. Because regardless of your political leaning, world's getting hotter, resources are getting scarcer, and the only way we're going to solve complex issues is together. So if we're able to identify with each other, I think that's a step in the right direction. And again, I use this at work when the different business units are trying to solve a complex issue. Well, I'm capabilities and I'm IT and I'm account manager. We're all working towards the same goal, right? So how can we get there together? And that's what I was trying to breed with the book. So by taking snapshots of memories, like again, I showed you the cover of the book earlier. I think we all have a picture of so I don't this isn't live, right? So this is the cover of the book, which is a family portrait. And I think we all have something like this that we can relate to. So I was hoping that if you saw something like this, A, you would notice my dad's awesome mustache, how pretty my mom is, right? But B, it would be important for you to say, hey, I know that. This is familiar. Let me look into this. What's inside this picture, right? So
Mm.
that's why it is a snapshot of memories. And when I was marketing the book, I used the Polaroid. Like, for example, for the one of the book releases that we had in Books and Books here in Miami, I gave away. I take a lot of pictures when I walk around the city, so I made those into Polaroids, printed them out, and used them as bookmarks, as an example, just as a reminder to take your own pictures, build your
Mm.
own memory.
I love that. So yeah, it's interesting that kind of like, yeah, it is, and it's not autobiographical, but it also has this undercurrent of you through all the
Oh yeah,
different, yeah, all the
it's
different poems.
uniquely me. I'm not washing my hands of that. Yeah, you and I were discussing that earlier, right? Only I could have written this book because only I, and again, this is not to say I'm the best, but it's only I had these life experiences that informed this viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm curious because so I want to talk a little bit about the other poem that I had kind of pulled out, which was Gavel. So I don't know if you want to read it first. It's like a short little one, but I loved it and it hit me like kind of viscerally when I was reading it. So I want to talk a little bit about that one, and I feel like it kind of runs with what we've just been talking about.
Of course, it's almost there.
Yeah, it's page 108. I wrote it down.
Oh, look at you. Gavel. Mother told me, don't be so deep. You are too deep, like the sea. Don't scare her with your overwhelming emotions because anyone would drown in the tide of your love. With gavel in hand, she sentenced me to an eternity of being someone else.
Yeah, so that last line really struck me, but the overall feeling of this idea of like being told don't be like this and trying to be someone else, that hit me really hard. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your thoughts on this one.
Sure. So gavel was written as maso, which is gavel in Spanish. It was written in Spanish first. It was part of a triptych, a series of three poems that had interconnecting ideas. I was very into rediscovering my Spanish roots in a way, my Peruvian roots, the Hispanic side of me, and I was exploring, poets like Rubén Darío, Neruda, and stuff like that. And I wanted this very florid colonial language. And then So there's the first one is like a song that's about falling in love. The second one is a letter about falling out of love or at that point. But I wanted to put a button on it with gavel because I think it's interesting that what a man is supposed to be when they are either seducing or having somebody fall in love with them, how they play the part and that role, right? And what they're supposed to be when we have and we also have these like generational ideas of what a man is in Hispanic culture. But and we have like the matriarch saying, "No, no, don't do that." But then that's the opposite of what they want their partners to be. And when they complain about men are not sensitive, men don't show their emotions, right? So it's interesting that I think one of the first people we want to impress as a man is our mother, right? Because our mother helps define. I know our father is a model of what a man is, but a mother nurtures that,
Mm.
right? Or she can provide an alternative to that, depending on where she's standing in her relationship with your father. So in that sort of traditional family, and it was just interesting for me to kind of do a short poem to play around with the themes of the other two poems and just put that to light. Like, you want to love? Well, you have to do it within these parameters, or not at all, right?
Yeah.
And then you can't be yourself, and what that was. So it was just a little fun exercise, a little button on them.
I loved it. I think that it speaks so much to there's so many different layers of that occurring. And that was certainly this idea of what is feminine, what is masculine, how do we show up as the like right version of ourselves, right? Is what we get all of this different information and we're trying to be fitting into these molds, I would say. And so, it's our family, it's our society, it's our culture. They all kind of mold us into thinking like we need to be a certain way. And so hearing that poem just really resonated with me going, "Oh, we become someone else because we think we need to be a certain type of archetype." And then on the flip side of that is like slowly starting to unravel that, right? Like slowly starting to process that and find who are we really beyond the things that we were told we were supposed to be.
Mhm.
So I loved that reflection in that poem.
Yeah, and I tried to. I don't really like talking about the intent again because I think I mentioned it before. I think
Yeah.
art becomes yours, but I did try to make the tone a little bit foreboding, not just matter of fact, like that this isn't right. Like that's my thing. Like whatever's happening here, you're being sentenced. You're being a victim to. You're being passive of. You're not having agency in, right? So there's so many things that you can do if you try to read the subtext of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do definitely agree. It was so interesting, like that ability to say this is your work of art and you poured yourself into it, but yet it is the reader then taking that and putting their own kind of spin or their own reflection on your words. And so it's true. It becomes every single person gets a different experience of your book. Right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
so I don't want to take up too much of your time. So, is there any, and I mentioned before we started, I was like, I could talk to you forever. I was like, there's so many things to talk about, but is there anything else that we haven't covered off on that you would like to share?
No, I could talk to you forever too. I'd really enjoyed this conversation, but if it continues, can't be one-sided, right? I really want to know more about you and more about your work and what you're doing. Um, Something that just happened this week, the book became a number one Amazon bestseller in a number of categories of poetry in Amazon. So that's great. That's thanks to a lot of people that have helped me out throughout this journey. I think you'll do social media handles at the end, so we don't have to go into that. It's
Mhm.
just for me talking about this book. I used to have a problem with it because it started off as a tax break for me. Like I'm just gonna write. I want to have a book published,
Mm.
and that's a goal. Check that off the list, and then how can I make this beneficial for me right now? And I went to see the movie Past Lives. That's up for the Oscars. Just beautiful. It's kind of in the vein of the Before
Love that.
trilogy that I also adore by Linklater. Beautiful movie, Past Lives. And I went there with a fellow author from my publishing company, Indie Earth Publishing, and Annie, Annie Vasquez, who also just wrote a book. She's fantastic. And when we were talking about the book, she asked me, like, what do you want to do about your book? And I'm like, oh, it's just a tax break. And she looked at me like I kicked her dog. Like, she said, I've read your book, and it's more than just a tax break. And that was the first time that I started thinking about this as being more than what box that I put it in, right? And then that again, that was just a reminder of the lesson that don't put anything in a box. Don't try to make it easier for yourself. Just be comfortable with the discomfort. Going back to yoga for this podcast, things are going to be what they'll be, and that's okay. You can't control the weather, right? We're kites dancing in hurricanes. So I stole that from a James Bond movie, so don't attribute that to me. We're kites dancing in hurricanes, but as long as we know how to fly, as long as we can adapt, then things are going to be okay. Things always end up being okay, you know? So,
Amazing. Well, first off, congratulations on the Amazon accolades. That's amazing. And I'm glad you now see your book as more than a tax break because it certainly is
still a
much
tax
more
break,
than that.
but it's more than that. It's more
Right,
than
right. We
that.
appreciate that part too, no doubt, but it gets to hold more space than that for sure.
I'm just kidding.
I love that. All right. So let's get into our final questions. So, your first question is, how would you describe your current relationship to yourself?
Evolving. I was very unkind to myself growing up. And I realized if I don't talk to my worst enemies this way, not that I have worst enemies, but like people I don't like this way, why would I talk to myself in such a derogatory fashion? And I, the big change for me came from realizing that perfection breeds paralysis, right? I don't want a pilot or a surgeon who's a perfectionist. I'd rather have somebody who has high standards that strives to meet them, and that's what I try to be now. So I think I know myself a little bit more, and I think I'm beginning. I like myself, but I think I'm starting to love myself now.
Mm, beautiful. Okay, next question is, what is something that you're currently working on?
Uh, so recently I was invited to take part in a short story anthology, and I'd never written a short story, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. So right now, and again, it was very similar to the poems, but in a little bit bigger snapshot. It was a couple in France on a winter's night just having a conversation in bed. That's what it was.
Mm,
And but the themes that you explored were that I explored were predestination versus destiny. I mean,
mm,
predestination versus agency, free will.
mhm.
Are we supposed to be together, or do I choose to be with you? That sort of thing, and then expanding it on other things. And I think I have an idea for either a novel or a short story anthology where we have the protagonist, again, putting them in situations that I've experienced that are autobiographical, but with the ideas of existentialism or generational trauma or any of those things, just maybe 13 moments of special moments I've had with people that I've loved, right? To go with that theme of us being made up of those things. And either have and then not naming the protagonist so that the reader can see themselves in it, explore in it, and then maybe either it be short stories or use some sort of narrative device to tie them together into a full narrative, but letting that be on the reader. So I started jotting stuff down 2 days ago for that.
Very cool. I look forward to reading it.
Oh, cool. I'll send you the short story. You let me
Please
know what you
do. Please do. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention, I also love Past Lives, by the way. So I love that you brought that up. It's so
so
good.
good. That soundtrack is so good.
It is. I've literally already watched it 3 times. It's kind of ridiculous. It's like
Yeah.
one of my favorite movies.
Have you seen the Before trilogy?
No, I
Before
haven't.
sunset, before sunrise, before sunset, before midnight.
Right.
You
I've
know,
heard that there's a similar thing to it.
you like past lives?
I loved it.
Watch the Before trilogy.
Okay.
Okay.
That is my homework.
That is my recommendation. Link later if you're listening. We love you.
Okay, I love that. I will get right on that.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is what do you consider most valuable to you right now?
Time. Time. It's my family, of course, but time. I'll share another short story if you have the time. When I was driving, again, this all like my dad's death has been definitely a formative experience for me, right? So I was driving him to his last chemo before they told him that we had to go to hospice. And we were just driving the car. I remember it was like Duran Duran was playing on the radio, Come Undone. And he looks at me, grabs my hand, and he says, "You know what the most difficult thing I've ever had to go through?" And I'm like, my grandfather died during Christmas. I asked that. His best friend died in a helicopter crash. My dad was a pilot. Um, I was asking all these things, and he said, "No, it was a divorce. It
Mm.
was a divorce." I'm like, okay. And then he just turned around. He didn't want to talk about it. He just shared it. I'm like, okay. Gave him his space. When he passed, um, my my aunt, who is was advising us on some of the finances, she shared with us that my parents never remarried, but they kind of ended up together at the end. And he, when she told him like, "Why don't you marry Rosario so she can get your benefits?" He's like, "No, we were married over about 15 years, so she gets all the benefits and all that stuff." And when she pressed him again, he just said, "I don't want to mess it up. We have something good going right now. I don't want to mess it up." And then he had left my sister and I the house that we grew up in, but maybe 2 weeks before my mom died, my dad died. He called my sister and I and said, "Hey, can you transfer the house to your mom's name?" I'm like, "Sure, Dad. Why? But why didn't we do it earlier? Because you have to go through probate. It's this whole thing. It's crazy."
Mm.
And he said, "I just want her to know that she's important to me." And I told him she's downstairs. I'll call her right now. Just tell her. And then something happened and didn't happen. And then the last thing is when he passed, he asked me to help him set up his funeral. He took care of all that stuff, and I helped him with it because I was the only one who was able to stomach it. My sister and my mom, not so much.
Mhm.
My brother-in-law either. Big for nothing, man. Chris, Chris either. And when I looked at the funeral plot arrangements, he had bought a funeral plot for my mom and him.
Mm.
So this is a very Catholic man. He believes in the resuscitation of the dead, and you wouldn't share the plot where your eternal souls, which he believed would go with just anyone. But he never really told her that while he was alive. They showed it to each other, but he never really told her. And the lesson he left for me was if you have time, use it. Tell people what you feel about them. Tell them that they're special to you. Don't take it for granted. Life could be over tomorrow. Are you doing what you want to do? Are you happy? Do you even know what would make you happy? Are you working towards that? So for me, the most valuable commodity that I have right now is time.
Wow. What a story. That was
Mm,
beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It was
sure.
it was inspiring me and I was just sitting there going, wow. I hope anyone that's listening is taking that in because it is true. And um it's so poignant the ability to really express and share and really tell people like how you feel and be able to make sure that they know. And so I'm glad your father was able to show it in his own way, even if it wasn't through words.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Thank you.
of course. Okay. So next question is what is the best lesson you've learned recently?
That one. No, the best lesson I've learned recently is uh, that life can still surprise you. I there are moments when I think I'm gonna make a right turn and I can't, and it can be frustrating in terms of like what I want to do. I just recently got a promotion at work that was so anticlimactic, and I so I just became a vice president, and they gave me more people and all that. But I to realize that it doesn't matter anymore. Originally, I wanted that because I was in a relationship with somebody who's French, and I wanted to be able to transfer to Europe with the same socioeconomic status that I worked so hard to achieve here.
Mm.
European professionals come to the US because blue collar and white collar workers, their salaries are not that different over in Europe, but executives are. And I was working really hard to be an executive so I can go over there and kind of have like a life here and a life there. And that relationship didn't work out. And the seeds that I had planted for that eventually gave fruit. And when it hit, I was like, oh, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the way it used to.
Mm.
But that led to some other situations here. And I'm not trying to be cryptic. I'm just trying to, that just, I'm so glad I'm here right now. I'm so glad life had these presents, these gifts for me right now, where I'm supposed to be. All of that stuff has led me to this moment. I don't want to say I'm because I don't like the idea of destiny. Like I don't like to be a puppet. I'd like to have my own agency. I'd like things to work out that way. Maybe it's both, like Forrest Gump said. I don't know. That's kind of what the short story's about. So you'll see it when I send it. But I'm so grateful that I am where I am right now, and I'm so surprised that I'm grateful that I am where I am right now. Life can
Amazing.
still surprise you.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love you saying that just because we're talking about how, the book has a lot of the past, but it's also like and we've talked so much about being present, but it's this idea of like enjoying what's to come as well, and just not knowing in a way.
It's because I was so focused on the future that I forgot about the present moment, right?
Mhm.
And our present is a direct result of our past. So if we focus on the present moment, we build our future by default. So just being in that middle tier instead of trying to be in one, like focus too much, like, oh, I was hurt, I was this, I can't get over it. That's the past. I need to be safe. I need to build this. I need to have this. That's the future. But if we're here now and we live our lives to the best of our ability, try not to hurt anyone, try to enrich, create, like I said, right? Enrich somebody else's life. Make sure they're better off because they met you. Your future is being built in that moment. It guarantees a future.
Mm,
So
amazing.
it's that releasing that fear, not moving from a fear based perspective, I think allows you to enjoy yourself so much more.
Yeah. And yeah, I firmly agree with that. It's like our future is built on this present right now. But it's finding that appreciation and living in it, right? And not being so tied up in the past and the future, and just being here and seeing the gifts that you have right now. That's so important.
Yeah.
All right. So, final question, which I feel like leads right off of everything we've been talking about, is what do you see as the meaning or purpose of life?
Creation, creation, um, connection, communication, right? Like, it's like I mentioned, I think that the world's going through some stuff right now, right? And I think that we've become so disassociated from ourselves that we can't empathize with others. We can barely sympathize anymore, right? And I think that by creating something, you will understand somebody else that made something, right? By sharing your experience, you'll understand somebody that had a different experience. By going out and having new experiences, learning different languages, you'll be able to see things from a different perspective. When I am solving a problem and I'm thinking in Spanish, I tend to be more emotional about it. I don't know. It's just the way that I am. When I think about it in English, I tend to be more logical about it. And then in the past, Italian and Portuguese and French, I was thinking about it in different ways too, because it was an extra. I wasn't that good, but I was at least literate and fluent. Fifth grade maybe, but fluent. And just seeing the way that different cultures think about the same thing in different ways allows you to look at things from so many different perspectives, from so many different vantage points that just give you a richer experience. And by creating something, you'll realize why you shouldn't tear something down. So we just talked about past lives, criticism, right? Literary criticism or film criticism. The book, some people will like it, some people won't. But saying, "Oh, this movie, it's garbage. It sucked." Somebody put their life into that, right? Like maybe it doesn't jive with you, and you can look at it. No, there's something there might be something to enjoy here, right? What about you is rejecting this? And that is also. I'm not saying you can't have your opinion, but I'm saying don't be so dismissive. See what it is that you don't like about it. Is that more about you? Is that more about the thing? There's some things that are inflammatory that, of course, I'm not saying like, but just if we just go a little bit deeper.
I love that. You speak to a level of like introspection that I think is so needed, where it's like, how are we taking in works of art or whatever is going on around us, and then seeing like how it is affecting us and kind of looking a little bit closer. And so I so appreciate that because I think it's true. Many people don't do that, but I think it's such an important part of us becoming that next version of ourselves is really being
Mhm.
able to look a little closer of like, why is this affecting me in this way? Why am I criticizing this? Why am I having this kind of reaction to different things? So I love that idea.
Thank you. Me too.
Absolutely. Well, as I said, I could talk to you all day. But I think for this version, this episode, we'll have to wrap up here. So we will absolutely put a link to your book, but can you please share how else people can get in touch with you?
Sure. I am on Instagram at elrenz, ELRENZ. I am on LinkedIn under my name, Renzo del Castillo, so you guys can see that I'm actually an executive in healthcare. I do post a lot about the book there too. Um, Book is available on Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble, anywhere books are sold, really. Books and Books in Miami as well. Different art shops like zine shops like Dalezine, which is a local institution here. It's just if you can buy local, support local bookstores, local artists, and go out and see an open mic. Go out and see something you wouldn't see. You mentioned like, oh, I wasn't really into poetry, and now I saw this book and I read some of the poems, spoke to me. I kind of want to see more. Yeah, go out and explore it. Go out and explore all of those things. So I'm just very grateful to have the opportunity to meet you and be put here on your platform. And hopefully this reaches some of your followers that it speaks to them too. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Actually, I have one last question, like this a
Sure.
little for me, but I might as well ask while we're recording.
Of course.
I absolutely think that everyone should go and grab a copy of Still. And I'm curious, as someone who is now interested in poetry after reading your book, what is a book that you would recommend for someone who is like getting into poetry?
Oh man, it depends on what you're into, right? So, 100 Love Sonnets by Neruda is just beautiful if you're into like the romance. Bukowski if you're just like poetry is the poet's what did he say? It's like poetry is the poet's business and fuck everybody else. If you can bleep that out if I can't curse. Like, but that's Bukowski, right? And Szymborska, just like a collection was Lawa Szymborska's collected poems. She was a Nobel laureate. She was Polish, and she wrote this. I always talk about this poem, but I love it so much. It's called Vocabulary, and it starts with La Pologne. Is it terribly cold there? It's somebody asking the writer, her, is it terribly cold in Poland? And she goes into this beautiful, florid language of her people doing writing in mittens and icicles and walruses, and you have to cut like the words around you with an axe because it's so cold. But she says, I can't remember the word for walrus. or icicle. So she just says pas du tout, like little bit, not so much. And how much is lost in translation, but there's an underlying theme of all the different countries that were popping up in Europe after World War II, having all of these people mix and having, Poland or Polish people have to immigrate to France to find a place to rebuild, right? So just the layers of that. So I'm going to send you a list of recommended books for
Please
sure.
do. Please do. You have opened my world to poetry, which I so appreciate. Well, thank you again so much, Renzo. It's been so wonderful talking with you. I hope everyone goes and grabs a copy of your book. It is such a wonderful collection of poetry. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure. It really has. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.